Hi, and welcome to the fifth video presentation for our English 3175 Issues in Documentary course. This one has a long title and it's called Lumiere, Warhol, Slow Cinema, and Documentary Aesthetics. At the beginning of the semester, we talked a little bit about the inventors of cinema, the brothers Lumiere, Auguste and Louis Lumiere, and now we're returning to that in order to sort of follow a through line of an aesthetic tendency that has an influence both on fiction, film, and documentary. The thing to remember about the Lumiere films is that they were short. They had invented a camera that would allow for 45 seconds of filming, but no more. And so their films were usually static, one shot, and very short. And they were prized by their audiences not because, remember, they presented a story, but because they presented this portrayal of reality that was much more realistic than any art form could accommodate at the time. It was a miraculous representation of the world. And so it's fair to say, I think, that the brothers Lumiere were, in some ways, the first documentarians. And the first documentaries were the instances of real life that they found around their homes and in their families. Some of their earliest films feature their children, such as Auguste's son here, who is in the short Fishing for Goldfish from 1895, where he wears his fancy gown and then nonetheless starts to grab at the fish that are in the fishbowl here. The very earliest Lumiere films are home movies, documentaries that portray the Lumiere's everyday lives in lieu of other subjects besides the, let's say, for example, the workers that they were able to shoot at their Lyon photographic factory. But even that, of course, is an extension of their everyday lives, and that was the form of documentary that the earliest films took. Of course, the fact that the Lumiere films were simple did not mean that they didn't partake of the ideologies and connections to politics and beliefs of the time. One of the most important modes that the Lumieres did is that they photographed everyday life not only in rural France where they lived, but also around the world. In 1897, for example, they employed a cinematographer named Gabriel Vere to go to Japan to photograph instances of Japanese culture. A tea service, let's say, for example, or in a very famous film, Samurai Practice with bamboo swords, where a number of different fighters are jostling and bouncing around the frame in a way that, in some ways, unfortunately makes the samurai battle more comic than it does lend nobility to these warriors. Perhaps the most telling ideological sort of version of a Lumiere film during Vere's travels were when he went to India and he shot a 45-second film of a white missionary throwing grain upon the ground and all the poor kids in India scrabbling to get the grain and to get the food. In unconscious, I think, commentary on imperialism and colonialism. Of course, we see these sort of travel aesthetics and this idea of exoticizing the other appear in Flaherty's Nanook of the North, where Flaherty builds a story around Nanook in ways that go back to our discussions about documentary manipulation. Throughout its entire history, Nanook of the North has been seen as kind of a half documentary and half constructed. And some people make excuses for Flaherty's sort of blurring of the truth a little bit. So, for example, none of the igloos are complete in the film. And there was no threat to them, let's say, for example, at the end of the film when they encounter the storm, because they were sleeping in a half igloo so that the camera could be able to photograph them inside the igloo. The cameras were simply too small to fit into the igloos. Is that manipulation? Well, we go back to Errol Morris's arguments about the Valley of the Shadow of Death. You know, if you half an igloo or you move cannonballs onto a road, are you manipulating reality? Or are you doing your best with the equipment that you have in order to dramatize and in order to capture a reality that nevertheless happened? That's an open question, and a question that I don't think we solved in the first unit, and we're never going to solve because it's one of those chicken and the egg questions. But Nanook of the North is definitely similar to the sort of travel films that the Lumieres started to make with other cinematographers in the late 1800s, because they take people to places like Alaska or Japan or India or China, and sort of exoticize the other and sort of act as a kind of travelogue for people who, most people died within 50 miles of where they were born. And so this idea of travelogue that would take you to other countries was one of the great miracles of documentary cinema at the time. As cinema became more sophisticated, with sound, with editing, with more than one shot, with special effects. There was a movement away from the foundational documentary aesthetics of cinema. And it was only until the 1960s when an unusual party came along to sort of revive the idea of the Lumiere aesthetics. That unusual party was Andy Warhol, the famous visual artist who was also a filmmaker, particularly during the 1960s, and who masterminded most of his creations with a crew of other artists at a place called The Factory, which had 3 locations between 1964 and 1983, where most of Warhol's films were shot in the first iteration of The Factory. This is a great photograph of The Factory because it shows the factory was painted white and had foil covering just about everything in the factory. The idea was to make it silver. The idea was to make it prefab. The idea was to make it artificial. The idea was to make life into art. In a corner of the factory, Warhol set up a Bolex 16mm camera and a chair. And when anyone would come into the factory, he would encourage them to sit in the chair, and he would simply photograph a 3-minute portrait of their face. These were called the screen tests, and he did over 120 over the course of 2 years. And in the process of doing these screen tests, he captured a lot of celebrities. So Lou Reed, for example, who was yet to be a celebrity, but who was discovered by Warhol. Salvador Dali, Dennis Hopper, and here, one of Warhol's major starlets in the movies that he made in the 1960s, Edie Sedgwick. And these are interesting because Warhol deliberately went back to the idea of the Lumiere aesthetic. One take, capturing reality without telling a story, photographing a face, indulging in a mode of portraiture, which is kind of perverse in a medium where movement is so key. And yet these films are incredibly beautiful. I'll show one in class this week just so you get a sense of what the screen tests are like. But they're kind of go against the grain of more sophisticated, more fiction-driven cinema, and yet they return us to the very essence of cinema. Jeanne Dielman, then, the film that you watched for this week, is unthinkable without Warhol's kind of postmodern appropriations of Lumiere's aesthetics. Jeanne Dielman, of course, is 3 hours long, and most of that 3 hours is occupied by watching a housewife do chores in real time. Now, what is the purpose of this? Why does Ackerman, who had made films that were perfectly sophisticated and fiction-based before and after making Jeanne Dielman, what is the purpose of making a film that returns so decisively and so boringly back to the Lumiere aesthetics? Because I suspect, and I'm looking forward to the discussions that we'll have this week, that you found this film boring. And I do too, but I think one of the interesting things about it is that boredom is used here as a weapon. Ackerman knows exactly how an audience is going to react to her film, and the reason why she does it that way is because she wants you to feel that boredom. For 3 hours, you watch a housewife do chores. Now, that sounds boring, and it is boring, but if you are that housewife in real life, and let's not forget in 1975, women did the vast majority of chores in the traditional nuclear family. What if you were that woman who did those chores every day for the rest of your life? It's a feminist weaponization of this aesthetic of boredom that was developed by Warhol into a kind of feminist statement about the unequal distribution of housework in both Western Europe, which is, of course, where Jeanne Dielman was made, and in America. It is, I think, in some ways, the ultimate feminist statement on housework, and it's because of that boredom that makes you feel exactly what that housewife feels and the frustration that she feels. That might explain, of course, why she kills her client at the end of the film. But I want to talk about that. I want to talk this week also about Jeanne Dielman, not only in terms of it being a weaponized feminist boredom, but also in terms of what you think of the prostitution plot in the film. It plays a very small role compared to the chores that Jeanne Dielman does around her apartment. But why include such a sensationalistic, if you want to call it that, subplot in the film in the first place? We'll talk about that in class this week. The Lumiere aesthetic, as developed by Warhol and by Ackerman, develops into a new genre of art cinema that we see called slow cinema. And the Wikipedia definition actually is pretty good here, so I'll just read it. Slow cinema is a genre of art cinema filmmaking that emphasizes long takes and is typically characterized by a style that is minimalist, observational, and with little or no narrative. It is sometimes called contemplative cinema. And there are other precursors of this style as well. On the still here, you see director Michelangelo Antonioni with his leading lady, Monica Vitti. And Antonioni made a series of films in the early 1960s that deliberately traffic in this idea of slow cinema. One of the films, The Eclipse from 1963, features Monica Vitti and Alain Delon as two lovers who decide to run away at the end of the film, and they make an appointment to meet at 9 o'clock in the village square to leave together, to leave behind the lives that they find so bourgeois and so boring. And then the movie ends with 15 minutes of shots of the village square, and neither of them show up. And that's the way the movie ends, with this kind of descriptive shots of a street lamp, of the grass being watered in the village square, of people walking by, but not the people that we expect to see. And that's the way the movie ends. This idea of contemplative cinema that will linger on places, that will linger on the documentary representation of real locations, is part of what defines slow cinema. And I see an intersection between the slow, contemplative emphasis on nature that you see in slow cinema with documentary. Some of the directors associated with the long take, slow, contemplative aesthetic include Andrei Tarkovsky, who you may be familiar with. Perhaps you've seen Solaris or The Sacrifice, or his ravishingly beautiful science fiction film, albeit not one that's rife with special effects, Stalker from 1979. You may be also familiar with the work of Hungarian director Béla Tarr, who is retired from filmmaking, but not before he made the 7.5-hour-long masterpiece Santan Tango, about a boy who lives in dire economic circumstances. Much of the film is just spending time with the boy, home movies, if you will, shot in long takes the same way that perhaps the Lumiere films were a century before. And there are whole film movements built on this idea of slow cinema, such as the Romanian New Wave, which exploded in the early 20th century. Some of you know that one of my favorite films of the 21st century is 4 Months, 3 Weeks, and 2 Days, directed by the Romanian director Cristian Mungi, which is comprised of excruciating long takes and focuses on a woman who you see in the frame here in green blouse, helping her friend to get an abortion when an abortion was legal in Romania in the late 1980s. It's a brutal film, made more brutal by the fact that the long takes and the absolute emphasis on shabby interiors and real-life grim locations in the waning days of Romanian communism just capture just how horrible Romania must have been in the late 1980s, in a way that perhaps a film that rebuilt Romania rather than focused on those locations could never do. As we begin a new unit in our class, we're going to explore the intersections between documentaries and fiction films by asking a couple of different questions. One, does the idea of slow cinema move fiction film closer to documentary? That is, the languishing in particular places, the long takes, and respecting the sort of time of reality rather than editing it up. Is that a documentary aesthetic, and does it move films like 4 Months, 3 Weeks, and 2 Days closer to the condition of documentary? And the other, of course, and this is the reading that you're doing for this week, is the process genre one Venn diagram intersection between documentary and fiction films, right? This is still up here on the PowerPoint from that short excerpt from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that I had you watch about the manufacturing of crayons. But the fact that both fiction films and documentary films show process, is that another possible intersection between fiction films and documentaries, the same way that slow cinema might be? So we'll consider those questions in class this week, and I'll see you then.